The storm came down the mountains like a living thing, wild, merciless, and white. The air was a roar of wind and ice that cut through wool and leather alike. Snowflakes as sharp as shards of glass stung the cowboy's face as he rode, his hat pulled low and his scarf frozen stiff across his mouth. Each breath burned like fire in his lungs. Jake Callahan had seen plenty of winters in Wyoming, but never one like this. It had rolled in fast, swallowing the sky in less than an hour, turning daylight to dusk. The trail beneath his horse was gone now, buried beneath drifts that rose higher with every gust. He should have turned back hours ago. But home was still miles away, and something deep in his bones told him stopping meant dying. The wind howled like a pack of wolves across the plains, battering man and beast alike. Jake leaned low over his horse's neck, murmuring words of encouragement that froze in the air between them. The animal was trembling, exhausted, but loyal enough to keep moving. The cowboy's gloved hands were stiff on the reins, his fingers numb despite the layers. He tried to think of the fire waiting for him back at his ranch, the promise of warmth and quiet. But that vision was fading, replaced by the stark, deadly truth that no man survived long in a storm like this. He needed shelter, any shelter, and soon. Then, through the blinding white, a flicker caught his eye, thin and faint, like smoke twisting upward before the wind shredded it away. Jake blinked, uncertain whether it was real or a trick of his weary mind. But there it was again, a wisp of gray rising from a copse of pines half buried in snow. He nudged his horse toward it. The wind fought him every step, the drifts grabbing at the animal's legs, the cold gnawing through his coat. When he finally reached the grove, his heart sank. The cabin that stood there, or what was left of it, was half collapsed, its roof caved in beneath the heavy weight of snow. One wall had given way entirely, the logs scattered like matchsticks. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. He tied the reins to a branch and called out, voice hoarse from cold. "Hello? Anybody in there?" The only answer was the moan of the wind through the wreckage. He stepped closer, squinting through the swirling snow. The place looked abandoned, no movement, no light, no sound. Then, as he turned to leave, he thought he heard something, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A cry. Not the cry of wind or beast, but the fragile, desperate wail of a baby. Jake froze. His heart kicked hard in his chest. He held his breath and listened again, every nerve straining. There it was, a tiny whimper muffled by snow and timber. He scrambled forward, shoving aside a beam. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm coming." The storm seemed to rage louder, as if angry that he'd heard. Snow whipped into his eyes, but he didn't care. Somewhere under that wreckage was a life. 2, maybe. And if he didn't get to them now, they wouldn't last another hour. The closer Jake got, the worse it looked. The cabin wasn't just damaged. It was crushed, half swallowed by snow and fallen timber. One corner had caved in completely, as though the mountain itself had pressed down its hand. Smoke still clung to the air in a thin, ghostly ribbon, whispering of a fire that had burned out hours ago. Jake's heart hammered. Somewhere under that wreckage, a baby had cried. Now the sound was gone, smothered maybe, or lost to the wind. He pushed forward, his boots sinking deep into the drift. The wooden porch was gone, buried under a mound of broken roof beams. He dropped to his knees and started clawing through the snow again, using his gloved hands this time, though they were stiff and bleeding beneath the leather. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. Nothing, just the groan of logs settling. Then, there. A faint moan, muffled and weak. He followed the sound, shifting the splintered boards piece by piece. Each one fought him, frozen in place, slick with ice. The wind tore at his coat, snow seeping down his collar, but he didn't stop. He pulled one heavy beam aside and froze. Under it, in a pocket of shadow, he saw a flash of color, a piece of a quilt. "Hang on," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I got you." He dug faster now, ignoring the pain. Beneath the quilt was a woman, her hair matted with snow, her face pale as milk. She was half buried, One arm curled around a small bundle at her chest. The sight of that arm nearly undid him. It wasn't limp from death, but still held tight, protectively, around the baby. Jake brushed the snow from her face. Her lips were blue, her lashes white with frost. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A pulse, thin, slow, but there. Relief slammed into him like a kick to the chest. Then he unwrapped the quilt slightly, revealing a baby boy, no older than a few months. The child whimpered softly, his tiny face red and raw from cold, but he was breathing. Alive. Jake exhaled shakily. "You're tougher than you look, little fella," he muttered, wrapping them both tighter. But they wouldn't last long in this cold. He had to move fast. The roof could collapse further at any moment, and the snow wasn't done falling. Jake looked around. He'd need space to pull them clear. With a grunt, he shifted another beam aside, straining until his back screamed. The logs rolled just enough for him to drag the woman free. When he finally got them both out, the full weight of the storm hit again, biting through his wet clothes. He set the woman down gently, her head resting on his saddlebag, and pulled off his coat to wrap around them both. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from cold and exhaustion. He couldn't stop long. Their lives depended on warmth. Jake pulled his horse closer, using its body as a windbreak. The animal snorted, anxious, but stood firm. With what dry twigs and scraps he could find under the snow, Jake managed to spark a tiny fire. The flame flickered weakly at first, then caught, glowing orange against the endless white. The woman stirred faintly, her lips moving. He leaned closer. "Ma'am?" Her voice was no more than a whisper. "My baby, please!" "He's safe," Jake said quickly, pulling the infant closer to her chest. "You both are." For a moment her eyes opened, green, glassy with cold. She looked at him as though trying to place a face in a dream, then went still again, her lashes closing. Jake swallowed hard. He'd found them alive, but the fight wasn't over. The cabin might have taken her home, her husband, everything she'd known. But as he looked down at her and the child, he made himself a promise. He'd see them through the storm. No matter what it cost him, Jake threw off his gloves and dropped to his knees, clawing at the snow with his bare hands. The cold bit deep, splitting the skin of his fingers, but he barely felt it. All that mattered now was the sound of that tiny cry, the sound of someone who still had a chance. And in that moment, alone against the storm, Jake Callahan swore to himself he would not let that cry be silenced. The snow kept falling, heavy and relentless, as though the heavens meant to bury every trace of life beneath it. The weak flame Jake had managed to coax to life sputtered under the wind's assault. But it was enough to thaw his frozen fingers, just enough for him to keep working. The woman and her baby were breathing, but barely, and the wreckage around them still groaned, threatening to collapse the rest of the way. Jake's heart pounded like a hammer against his ribs. He needed to clear more space, to make sure nothing else would fall on them when he tried to move her fully. The broken timbers were slick with ice and twisted at cruel angles, some wedged deep into the snow. Every time he pulled one free, another shifted dangerously. He knew one wrong move could crush them all, but Jake Callahan wasn't the kind of man who weighed odds when lives were on the line. He spat into the snow, braced his boots, and started again, gripping a beam with raw, bleeding hands. His gloves were long gone, his knuckles split and red. The cold burned like fire, but pain was a small price for time. "Come on now," he muttered between breaths. "You held out this long. Don't quit on me now." He worked faster, pulling, prying, throwing broken pieces behind him. His horse shifted restlessly nearby, snorting clouds into the freezing air. Each sound reminded him that the storm was still growing stronger, not weaker. He had hours, maybe less, before darkness fell again. When he cleared the last heavy plank, the full scene of destruction came into view. The woman had been lying on what was once the cabin's floor, now canted sideways under the pressure of snow and debris. Around her were scattered signs of a life abruptly shattered, a rocking chair half buried, a pot tipped over, a photograph face down in the snow. Jake paused for a moment, staring at the picture. It showed a young couple smiling, the woman's arm around a man in a trapper's coat. The same green eyes, the same soft mouth. Her husband. Gone now, somewhere in this white wilderness, leaving her to face the storm alone. Jake shoved the image into his coat pocket and went back to work. There'd be time for sorrow later, if they lived to see it. He knelt beside her again. Her breathing was shallow, her skin icy to the touch. He pulled her baby closer, tucking the small bundle under his shirt against the heat of his chest. The child whimpered once, then fell silent, lulled by the steady beat of Jake's heart. The sound gave him strength. He lifted the woman into his arms, the weight of her fragile but real. "I got you," he murmured. "You're safe now." The words were a promise, to her, to the baby, and maybe to himself. When he stood, his legs trembled from cold and exhaustion. The path back to his horse was half buried already. The cabin cracked somewhere behind him, another section giving way under the weight of snow. He didn't look back. Some things you couldn't fix, only survive. He laid the woman across his saddle, careful not to jostle her, and wrapped both her and the baby in every scrap of warmth he had. His coat, his blanket, even his scarf. Then with shaking hands he took up the reins. "Let's go, boy," he said softly to his horse. "We're not leaving him here." The horse snorted and stepped forward through the white wilderness, hooves crunching, tail whipping in the wind. Jake followed on foot, one hand on the mare's side, the other steadying the woman and her child. Behind them, the ruined cabin groaned one last time before it collapsed entirely into the snow. Jake didn't turn around. He'd already saved what mattered most, and though he couldn't yet see the road ahead through the blizzard, something deep in him knew. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The storm had eased only a little, but for Jake, every breath still came hard and cold. He trudged through the snow beside his horse, one arm steadying the woman draped across the saddle, the other shielding the baby tucked inside his coat. The little one's warmth against his chest was the only thing keeping his own heartbeat steady. The air was thick with silence now. No wind, no sound but the crunch of hooves and the faint creak of the saddle. The world around them was wide and endless, the horizon erased. Jake could feel the storm's weight pressing down on his shoulders, but he wouldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they were somewhere safe. After what felt like hours, his horse stumbled into a hollow between two rocky ridges. It wasn't much, just a shallow dip out of the worst of the wind, but it would have to do. He guided the mare into the shelter of the rocks and pulled the woman gently down from the saddle. Her skin was cold as snow, her lips pale and cracked. The baby stirred weakly at the sound of her name on his breath. "Hold on, ma'am," he whispered. "You gotta stay with me now. You hear?" There was no answer. Jake's fingers shook as he gathered dry brush from beneath the rocks, whatever the wind hadn't stolen. His hands were raw, the cuts on his palms stinging, but he managed to spark a fire. The flames caught slowly, licking up through the twigs, casting a warm orange glow that painted life back onto the snow around them. He sat the woman close to the heat, leaning her against his saddle. Her eyelids fluttered once, barely, and her lips parted. He brought her closer, rubbing her arms briskly, forcing blood back into her veins. "Come on, ma'am. You gotta wake up." The baby whimpered again, and Jake smiled faintly. "That's right, little one. You tell her." The infant's cry, thin but fierce, seemed to stir something in the woman. Her lashes trembled, and her eyes blinked open for the briefest moment. They were a soft green, full of confusion and pain. She tried to move, whispering something he could barely hear. "Baby!" "He's right here," Jake said gently, lowering the bundle into her arms. "Right here with you." She looked down, eyes glassy, then up at him again, as though trying to see who was speaking through the blur of exhaustion. You found us?" Jake nodded. "Reckon I did." Her lips moved, but the words were lost to the wind. A moment later, her eyes closed again. Jake felt panic twist through him, but then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing, slowly, unevenly, but breathing. He wrapped his own coat tighter around her and the baby, feeding the fire every few minutes, coaxing it to burn brighter. The flickering light reflected in his weary eyes as he sat guard over them both, the weight of the day settling in. His hands ached, his back screamed, but he didn't dare close his eyes. Outside their small shelter, the wind began to howl again, sweeping across the plains like a warning. Jake glanced at the horizon. He knew the storm would build again before dawn, and if they stayed here, the cold would claim them all. He looked at the woman, the stranger he'd pulled from death's grip, and the tiny life bundled against her chest. Something inside him stirred, something fierce and protective. He'd seen death before, cattle lost to the cold, men frozen on the trail, but he wasn't about to let it take them. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, voice rough, "we move at first light. You're gonna live, both of you. I'll see to it." As the fire burned low, he leaned back against the rock, cradling the baby against his chest. The child's breathing was steady, soft, and rhythmic. The woman's pulse, faint but present, gave him something to hold on to, and there, under the storm's relentless gaze, Jake Callahan, rancher, loner, and wanderer, kept watch through the long, frozen night. For the first time in years he prayed, not for himself, for them. The storm had quieted, but the cold that followed was sharper than any blade. It sank through every layer of fabric, through skin and bone, settling in Jake's soul. The fire he'd built sputtered low, its embers glowing like dying stars, and the world beyond their little hollow was buried in snow so deep it erased all sign of the earth beneath it. Jake crouched close to the flames, rubbing warmth into his palms before pressing them gently against the woman's cheeks. Her skin was like marble, but when he leaned close, he could hear the faint whisper of her breathing. That fragile sound was the only thing keeping him going. "Stay with me, ma'am," he murmured, his voice rough from cold and fatigue. "Don't you go quittin' now." The baby stirred under his coat, tiny fists pressing weakly against his chest. Jake smiled faintly through cracked lips. "You're a tough little one," he said softly. "Got your mama's fight, I reckon." He checked on the woman again. Her face was pale, her hair damp with melting snow. He'd tucked her close to the fire, wrapped in his saddle blanket and his coat, but he knew it wasn't enough. They were on the edge, any colder, and she'd slip away for good. Jake tore into his pack, rummaging for anything that might help. He found a small flask of whiskey, nearly frozen, and held it in his hands until it thawed. He tilted it carefully toward her lips, letting a drop touch her tongue. She coughed weakly, the sound faint but alive. Relief washed through him. "That's it," he said, voice thick. "You hang on. Sunrise ain't far off." Hours passed like years. Jake kept the fire fed, breaking apart pieces of wood with his boot heel, feeding the flame bit by bit. He sang softly under his breath, an old trail song his mother used to hum when storms rolled in. The words barely mattered. It was the rhythm that steadied him, something human in a world gone white and silent. At some point, the woman stirred again. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Her lips moved, but her voice was a ghost. "My husband. He went for help." Jake swallowed hard. "I know, ma'am. I found you here. You're safe now." She blinked, her gaze drifting to the fire, then to the small bundle against his chest. "My baby." "He's fine," Jake said quickly. "Right here with us. Warm and breathing." Tears welled in her eyes, freezing almost as soon as they formed. "Thank you," she whispered. "I prayed someone would come." Jake looked into the fire. "Reckon somebody up there was listening?" For a long time, neither of them spoke. The flames crackled softly, painting their faces in gold and shadow. The baby whimpered now and then, but mostly slept, breathing deep and even. The storm outside had passed, leaving a silence so vast it felt sacred, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He could see the frost creeping back in, the woman's color fading again. He rubbed her hands, chafing warmth into them, whispering steady words like a prayer. "You got a little one needs you, you hear? Don't you let go." Her eyelids fluttered once more, and then, finally, her hand moved, curling weakly around his. That single motion undid him. Jake bowed his head, shoulders shaking from exhaustion and something deeper. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding back, how long it had been since he'd cared whether anyone lived or died. But tonight, staring into those fragile sparks of life, he felt something awaken. When dawn finally crept over the ridge, the sky bruised pink and gold, Jake was still awake. The woman was breathing steady now. The baby slept in peace, and Jake Callahan, who'd thought himself alone in this world, found himself whispering a promise he hadn't planned to make. "I'll get you both home," he said quietly. "No matter what it takes." The light touched their faces, warm and gentle. For the first time in years, Jake felt hope rise with the sun. When morning came, it wasn't gentle. The light was pale and cold like glass, sharp, colorless, unforgiving. Snow still drifted from the sky in lazy flakes, soft but endless. The storm had passed, but its shadow remained, a silence so deep it pressed against Jake's ears. He moved stiffly, his muscles screaming as he stretched. He hadn't slept. His eyes burned, his hands were raw, and his breath clouded in the freezing air like smoke. But he didn't care. The woman was alive, her breathing steadier now, her face no longer ghost white. The baby, snug against her chest, slept soundly. That was enough. Jake rubbed warmth into his horse's flanks, whispering, "You got one more ride in you, old girl?" The mare huffed softly, her breath steaming in the morning air. Her ears twitched toward him, tired but willing. That horse had the heart of a soldier. The world stretched white and endless in every direction. The snow had buried the land clean, no sign of road, fence, or track. But Jake knew the terrain by memory. The ridge to the west would lead toward his ranch, 8 miles, maybe 10 through deep snow. It would be brutal, but possible. He packed what little remained of his supplies. A few crumbs of jerky, half a flask of whiskey, his last match. He doused the fire, then turned to the woman. Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we can't stay here. The cold's coming back worse tonight. I'm taking you and the baby to my place." Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. You can't carry us both that far." Jake gave a half smile, the kind that came from stubborn men who'd already decided. "Ain't got a choice. You want to live, we move." He lifted her again, careful as if she were made of glass. She winced, her hand instinctively clutching the baby closer. Jake wrapped them both in the thickest blankets he had, tying them snugly with his saddle rope to keep out the wind. Then, with rough hands and a quiet prayer, he built a sled from the wreckage, 2 planks, some rope, and a strip of canvas for cover. Crude, but it would hold. He hitched it behind the mare, tightening the knots until his fingers bled anew. Then he looked down at the woman once more. Her eyes met his, still dazed but trusting now in a way that struck something deep in his chest. "You ready?" he asked. She gave a faint nod, voice trembling. "If you are," he smiled. "Ma'am, I was born ready for hard things." And with that, Jake clicked his tongue and the mare stepped forward. The sled creaked, groaning against the frozen snow, but it moved. Slowly at first, then steadier. Jake walked beside them, one hand on the reins, the other holding a length of rope tethered to the sled. The wind cut across his face, slicing at his skin. But he didn't slow. He counted each breath, each step, measuring time by the soft jingle of the horse's bridle. When the path rose toward the ridge, he dug his boots into the snow and pushed the sled forward, grunting with effort. Behind him, he could hear the faint cry of the baby, a small sound, alive and defiant against the quiet world. It gave him strength. Hours passed like that, an endless climb through blinding white. His vision blurred, his legs burned, and more than once he stumbled to his knees. But every time he looked back and saw the woman's face, pale but alive, he kept moving. By the time they crested the ridge, the sky was shifting to late afternoon, the sun weak behind thin clouds. Far ahead, a line of black dots broke the horizon. Fences. Home. Jake stopped, breath ragged, snow crusted in his beard. A small laugh escaped him, half relief, half disbelief. He turned back to the woman, her eyes half open. "We made it," he said, voice hoarse but sure. "Just a little farther and you'll be warm again." And as the mare trudged on, pulling that fragile bundle of life toward safety, Jake realized something strange. For the first time in years, he wasn't riding away from something. He was riding toward something that mattered.